Hello and welcome to Budget Debate 2024-2025. I'm your host, Andrew Laidley. Thank you for joining us. Tonight is the first of a series of one-hour discussions where we will go through the major elements contained in the proposed $1.3 trillion estimates of expenditure. Joining us this evening are a fine selection of economic expertise. With us in studio are Economist Keenan Falconer, stockbroker Mr. Ryan Strawn, and Cleveland Tomlinson, junior opposition spokesperson on finance and planning. Now, before we engage with our panel, here's a report I put together to help familiarize you with key terms and the overall structure associated with the budget.
Projects that are embarked upon annually by the government. These are usually social intervention programs. Some of Jamaica's recurrent programs include the maintenance of roads and other physical infrastructure, production incentives to farmers, and the continued rehabilitation of farm roads, streetlights for all 14 municipal corporations, starting to execute the national census, the program of advancement through health and education path, central government pension benefits, natural disaster risk management.
Okay, something about the feature. Hello and welcome to Budget Debate 2024-2025. I'm your host, Andrew Laidley. Thank you for joining us. Tonight is the first of a series of one-hour discussions where we'll be going through the major elements contained in the proposed $1.3 trillion estimates of expenditure. Joining us this evening are a fine selection of economic expertise. With us in studio are Economist Keenan Falconer, stockbroker Mr. Ryan Strawn, and Cleveland Tomlinson, junior opposition spokesperson on finance and planning. Now, just before we engage with our panel, here's a report I put together to help familiarize you with key terms and the overall structure associated with the budget. It's Budget Day 2024, and if you've been on social media, then you've probably come across a campaign like this.
$1.3 trillion. That's the figure budgeted for the fiscal year 2024-2025, which begins on April 1. The national budget is everybody's business because it impacts every Jamaican.
It's created by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and designed to get you interested in the national budget.
The overall central government spending goes towards debt servicing, recurrent programs, wages and salaries, capital expenditure, and providing loans to public bodies. Recurrent programs are a number of projects that are embarked upon annually by the government. These are usually social intervention programs. Some of Jamaica's recurrent programs include the maintenance of roads and other physical infrastructure, production incentives to farmers, and the continued rehabilitation of farm roads, streetlights for all 14 municipal corporations, starting to execute the national census, the program of advancement through health and education path, central government pension benefits, natural disaster risk management, among several others.
Aside from the opening of the budget debate today, other key speakers will be making their presentations.
Opposition leader Mark Golding will make his contribution on Tuesday, March 19. Prime Minister Andrew Holness will speak on Thursday, March 21, and on Tuesday, March 26, the Finance Minister will close the budget debate.
Now, I hope that was useful for some of our viewers. Macroeconomic outlook. Now, that's where we're going to start. We're going to start looking at the big numbers from the budget. And let me start with something that Dr. Clark spoke about in his presentation. That's GDP per capita. He said that that's roughly about $7,000 now per annum, and that's up from about $5,000 where it was at for quite some time, right? Now, when we do the math, and follow me here, we're working with the numbers. $7,000 would, work out to just about 583 US dollars per month. Translated to Jamaican dollar, that's just about $90,100 per month, right? But that's still among the lowest GDP per capita in the Caribbean, correct? So we've heard about low productivity rate, for example, as well as low paying jobs. But we've also heard about record unemployment rate at 4.2%. So my question to you, and starting with you, Keenan, is what do you think accounts for this sluggish movement in GDP per capita?
I mean, the structural issues surrounding Jamaica's labor dynamics and employment, you find that despite unemployment being very low, a lot of the jobs that are created are not very high value added. And because of that, we have not been able to really make leaps and bounds in terms of our economic situation. The nominal GDP has been growing. Part of that is owing to inflation, but that gives the impression that our GDP per capita is growing, as well as the fact that our population remains very stable. And so that rise can be attributed mostly to those factors, but at the end of the day, the unemployment situation, it being the lowest in history, continued record lows, we now have to start looking at the quality of work if we want to raise that GDP per capita. There had been a discussion sometime way back, how it was in that after 60 years of independence, our overall performance had only doubled, right? But in 60 years, you're trying to look at least 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 100 times what it was in 1962. But in 2022, it being just twice as much what it was in 1962 is poor by any standard. It had only moved very fast in the first decade. And then after that, the last 50 years, it has just been not where we want to be if we want to get to the level of where previously developing countries ended up reaching. So those are some of the things that need to be addressed, but those are seemingly intractable issues. Those are not things that are solved overnight or even in one budget cycle.
Ryan, I want to put the same question to you because we're seeing where unemployment rate is at the lowest it's been in our, in our independent history. But is that simply cosmetic, or what's wrong with the equation there that we're not seeing the kind of productivity that we'd hope to see?
Yeah, I think it ties in large part to much of what Keenan would have said in terms of the bang for the buck from the labor force. And I use a very good example I think is relevant. When you look at some of the other Caribbean nations, specifically Trinidad, and the extent to which they manufacture much of what they consume, not in terms of food now, but in terms of like bleach and things of that nature, not for consumption, right? That's not just a manufacturing facility, but it also speaks to a number of persons being employed, when ordinarily when they would export the product in question, it would be sold by us, so we would trade, but not always produce. I think to counter that, we're going to need the kind of capital investments that we are seeing, but more than just that, hastier procurement to allow for that investment to be put in the ground, that capital to be put in the ground, as well as, one of the things that may be working against our manufacturing sector really achieving as much as it could is the cost of energy. Now, to counter that requires capital expenditure. So it's kind of one thing feeding into the other, and it not necessarily being corrected overnight.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think the fact that we are seeing the debt to GDP, the GDP per capita increase at the same time unemployment is falling, suggests that there is some measure of correlation between the two. Now, how do you get that quantum leap? It's going to be like in my world, a return on investment or a revenue to assets, right? Which is essentially saying capital expenditure will have to lead the way for us to, get to that $10,000, that $12,000. But that's also going to be a function of time and fixing some of the things that hinder us within.
I know you mentioned Trinidad there, but we have to also accept that they have some things going for them that we really don't have going for us. You touched on procurement, which I really do want to circle back to a little bit later, but I'm going to jump over to Cleveland now to say, really, what do you think needs to be done, Cleveland, to, when we're looking at the macroeconomic picture, to really bring GDP per capita up to the level of our peers in the Caribbean?
Well, first we need to acknowledge that there are structural impediments that prevent the economy from advancing. It has to begin from an acknowledgement that the economy remains stuck in a state of low utilization of technology, low wage and low growth. We celebrate a 4.2 low unemployment rate, but the problem is that we're not creating the kind of high-value jobs that are required to give people a real increase in their standard of living. I'm not sure how many persons know this, but to be calculated as, or to be counted as employed in Statins statistics, you really just need to be working for at least 5 hours a week, and then you're counted as being employed. Now, the income that you gain from working for 5 hours is not substantial to raise the kind of standard of living. So we need to look at how we can position our industries to begin to become high-valued industries. And that requires a degree of capital injection into these companies. It requires policy changes that will support these entities coming out of that state to now producing high levels of exports. We also need to look as well as to how we're incorporating technology. Economies that advance and economies that do well and raise their standard of living are economies that utilize technology to a far more degree than we see here in Jamaica. So we have to get the digitalization of the economy at a pace that it exceeds where it's at right now. We need to get higher value industries so we can produce more.
Yeah, but it's one thing to say that we need to get and we need to get this and we need to get that. Right. But what is the pathway towards that? And I'll leave you to ruminate on that a little bit because I want to jump back over to Ryan with a related issue, the debt to GDP, and you touched on it, right? The minister said that should be about 72% by the end of this fiscal year. And then he also mentioned, that would be the lowest in 30 years, right? So let's not jump over that. That's impressive. So, but we also, heard that he's wedded to this fiscal accountability framework and there will be no deviation, which we're also grateful for. My apologies. We also heard that debt to GDP should be about 64% by April of 2025, which would in fact be the lowest in 50 years. So I'm going to go to a break quickly, but I just want to leave you with this thought. Is this goal realistic or is it aspirational, right? And then I'll follow up with that after the break. You're watching the Budget Debate 2024-2025 right here on CVM Television. We take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Budget Debate 2024-2025, and this is the CVM's panel discussion edition of the Budget Debate. So, Ryan, we left off talking about debt to GDP and whether or not this 64% by April 2025 is realistic or aspirational.
Well, I think history will show that it's realistic based on the movement to date, most certainly the movement since I think since about the mid 2010s region, that 2014-15, the movement since then, has been relatively aggressive downwards. You know, especially I gather there's a statistic saying it's the third fastest rate of debt reduction globally. So I believe it's consistent with history. I think it's very realistic. In fact, I think there are some factors that could cause it to fall even faster, but may not necessarily be prudent to budget for that sort of thing, which is understandable. But I do definitely think it's more than likely to happen, and the attendant benefits will follow because of, you know, some of the deliberate policy positions taken to date and, you know, for some time.
Keenan, jumping over to you. I recall when we were under an IMF program, there were strict austerity measures to ensure that we got to the place where we are today. So I'm wondering what it will take then for us within, you know, basically a year to get to that place. What do you think is the thinking that the finance minister has to get us there?
Well, you see, when you speak about debt, particularly total public debt,
Right.
it's a bit of a misnomer to say that, you know, we're really paying down on debt. So the reason why debt to GDP goes down is really because nominal GDP continues to rise, and it's well over 3 trillion Jamaican dollars now.
Thank you.
And of course, because nominal GDP is rising, partially owing to inflation, partially owing to production, debt remains more or less constant. It fluctuates in a band of, say, 1.8 trillion to 2.2 trillion over the last 4 to 5 years. When it fluctuates between 2 trillion and 2.2 trillion, that just shows that the rate of redemptions and maturities, whatever debt is retired, now exceeds new issuances of debt. And so the debt stock remains very stable. So it's not so much that the government is going to pursue anything related to specific liability management operations than they have been doing very differently over the last decade. It's really now the medium-term debt management strategy, as it outlines how we are now going to reduce our foreign currency risk exposure, is one of the ways in which we are not aiming to add to this debt stock, as well as the fact that inflation rate, interest rate sensitivity, is not particularly great when you consider that the public debt stock, 70% are in fixed interest rate instruments, the other 30% in variable rate instruments. So these considerations aside, I think allied to increasing GDP, although there are some downsides on the growth forecast, understandably because of recessionary risks in our main trading partners, and as Ryan said, you don't want to overcompensate and overplan. But I think the trajectory is well on its way. It ought to reach just a shade below 60%, 58, 59 by 2026, 27, and then go down to 55% in 27, 28. Remember, that's still a year.
So you're not seeing that 64% by...
No, the 64% is the upcoming year, which is 24, 25. After that goes on to 58. After that goes on to 55.
Gotcha.
And so that trajectory, I think, will be maintained. It's a credit really to successive administrations that they have been able to do this to open up that fiscal space. Because remember, in the entire budget, you have 3 main areas that are essentially non-discretionary. Those are wages, pensions, and interest costs on debt. The interest costs on debt in particular, which is now 15% of revenues coming from 50%, right, shows you the massive effort to actually open up this space that we can now redirect what we would have spent on interest, which is crippling for many countries, to now putting it in other areas of recurrent and capital expenditure.
Okay, with that I want to transition back to Cleveland, because we heard about $500 billion of public investment expenditures programmed by the government over the next 5 years, right, Cleveland? The government also intends to get an additional $500 billion from the private sector. This was said by the finance minister during his presentation over that time period. We see where there's the proposed building up of roads, and we see the roads being built and we see the buildings going up, 4 new public hospitals to be built all at the same time. The question then is, right, is the budget lopsided, as opposition spokesman on finance Julian Robinson said? Are we seeing more infrastructure and public investment than investment in people? Cleveland.
It's a balancing act that any government has to manage delicately and carefully. We support the investments in infrastructure, and we understand the contributors of improved infrastructure to economic growth and development. But there are legitimate concerns about the kind of labor force that we have. Do we have the kind of high-skilled labor force that is required to exist in the kind of high-skilled industries that we want? So it's a legitimate concern to make a suggestion that there has to be a balancing between how a government spends on infrastructure and how it spends on investing in its human resource capacity.
But do you believe that it is lopsided?
It is. As Julian Robbins have highlighted, we see a disproportionate spending on infrastructure relative to investment in human resources. So I want to position this point carefully, because I don't want it to be said that we are against infrastructure development. We support that. We believe that the hospitals must be improved, the buildings, the road infrastructure. Those things are essential. But there's also another essential component that, in essence, is being disproportionately spent on. So we think that there needs to be improvement in getting the labor force skilled to a point where they can exist in high-skilled industries. We need to look more effectively at how HEART is churning out individuals that are ready and fit for purpose. We hear concerns from the private sector about whether the persons who are existing in the labor force have the kinds of skills required for the industries that exist today. So it's a legitimate concern raised by Julian.
Thank you, Cleveland. So I want to go back to you, Ryan, with a point that you made about procurement and the lengthy wait time and the kind of changes that would be required to get that capital investment into the country. What are your thoughts on the proposals which were made by the finance minister?
Right.
To get rid of sector committees, for example, and to significantly reduce wait time?
Right. I think it's grounded in an appreciation for the need for us to speed up deployment. At the same time, like anything of this nature, there will be risk, and the balancing of risk is required. So I think where we do have the submission that perhaps contracts of 10 million, as Julian would have said, could be something to be looked at, considered. But at the same time, we do have a robust framework that exists already. And as a result of that, I'll be very comfortable with placing the necessary trust in them. And I think we've also, I think there have been steps taken, I should say, to enhance the Integrity Commission by virtue of increased investments in that. And I genuinely get the impression from public disclosure that our framework is robust. Therefore, I'm not uncomfortable with what was put forward by the Minister of Finance as far as it concerns increasing the pace of deployment. Because for us to improve the labor environment, as both Keenan and Cleveland would have said, these things are required to invest more in our people and allow them to achieve their optimal performance will also require a speedier rate of procurement as well.
I see Cleveland jumping at the bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to support Ryan, and to add to what I would have said earlier, we really have a productivity challenge. And that productivity stems largely from the fact that we have persons in industries that don't have the right training for the kind of jobs that they're doing and are essentially not carrying out their duties with the degree of innovation that would add to higher output. But productivity is often looked at in the sense that we're looking at just human resource deficiencies. You would have heard from Julian that we need to broaden our perspective on how we look at productivity. And when we spend hours in traffic on the road, that is a productivity challenge. That's an impediment to productivity. And that is why you'd have heard out of our recommendation an idea to look at how we have public transportation existing. We have posited the idea that really needs a feasibility study at this point to see if it's something that can possibly take off. A light rail transit system in the corporate area. I'm sure when you come out on a Friday evening or any evening, afternoon 3 to 5, it's a challenge moving from Crossroad to downtown. It's a challenge moving from Crossroad to Papine. And the same obtains in the mornings as well. So productivity has to be looked at from the human resource side. It has to also be looked at from the public transportation side. But yes, the budget is lopsided in that its focus is disproportionately on infrastructure without that kind of human resource improvement.
All right, well, we're gearing up to come to, the part of the finance minister's presentation that I've personally been getting a lot of questions about, and I'll definitely be posing them to you, is the revenue measures component of his presentation. So we take another break here. You're watching Budget Debate 2024-2025, the CVM TV News Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Budget Debate 2024-2025 Extended. I'm Andrew Laidley. Still with us in studio are Economist Keenan Falconer, Cleveland Tomlinson Jr. Opposition spokesperson on finance and planning, as well as stockbroker Mr. Ryan Strawn. So we're jumping into an analysis of the revenue measures. We heard about security companies getting a duty break. We heard about independent power producers, customs duty thresholds being increased, personal allowances. We heard about GCT on all imported raw foods being removed, pension exemption, age relief, reverse tax credit, all of those things we heard about in the finance minister's presentation. When we take a good look at it, Keenan, the decisions that the finance minister took, is that, you would say from an economic perspective, are those sound decisions?
Well, I would describe the overall revenue measures in two ways. The first is to say that they're extremely targeted to very, very specific groups. I don't think I've seen in a budget presentation to specific demographics being targeted in the way that they have been in a non-emergency setting. Of course, during COVID, you had different categories of distribution. And the second thing is to say that these revenue measures, the fact that they are so targeted is really owing to the nature of the budget, with so much expenditure being crowded out by wages. Now having to find 25 billion through the securitization of receivables, it really shows that there is no less room to do those sorts of recurrent things. That's why some of the measures will only last for a year, for example. But the fact that they are so extremely targeted, they seem to be very creatively well thought out. I think augurs very well for those very specific groups. It's hard to have much broad-based measures when you consider wages had increased by 200 billion over the last 4 fiscal years, as opposed to recurrent expenses, 58 billion. And now you're trying to look at different areas in the budget. Where can I take that money? If I have to now spend on maintenance, if I have to spend on some new investments in capital infrastructure, but I also want to give back in a meaningful way, hopefully. The other consideration is the concept of equity. So when you're looking at giving 600,000 people $20,000 each, and the sheer scale of that adding up to $11 billion, right? It shows you that there was an effort, I think, to reach as many people as you can, regardless of what the amount might be, as opposed to, say, now giving 20,000 people $600,000, which, from an equity perspective, is not really ideal. Are we going to say more can be done? Of course, more can be done. We're always going to look at it in that lens. But balancing the fiscal considerations of the effort that had been made by governments to get us to this point, and now giving back in this targeted way, only makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, when you look at the big picture, the overall picture of the announcements which were made by the finance minister, should the Jamaican people be happy about the direction that the minister is going? For example, on the street, a lot of people were expecting a GCT reduction, for example, that they felt would have impacted them more directly and in their pockets. What are your thoughts on that?
Human nature dictates that one will always want more. So I wouldn't use the word happy. I think the Jamaican people should feel heard as far as it would concern there being challenges in all demographics, but specifically as you go from the lowest up, the challenges are a bit more pronounced. You know, as an economist, Keenan would know well that inflation disproportionately impacts the poor more. As such, while a fall in GCT or reduction could have been of help, it would have benefited not just the 70% earning below, I believe, 1.7 or 1.5, but the 30% above who spend more would have benefited as well. And so I join Keenan in saying that, yes, it was indeed targeted towards the groups that are most vulnerable. And I do think that the effort has been demonstrated. I cannot recall, and I'm not that old, I mean, I'm still young enough, I can't recall a time where there have been this many broad-based initiatives that have touched this many persons, such as, you know, one of my favorites in all of it, the pension threshold. Now, because I'm so far from the pension age, the concept of a threshold that's when you're 65 is not in my line of sight right now. But for the person who's been retired for 5 years, that is substantial, particularly if they were not necessarily earned at a particular level before. So I think that they should feel heard, and especially in the mass category, and have adequate reason to look forward to more of this nature in due course.
Thanks, Ryan. Cleveland, I want to pose, you know, this problem that I keep hearing on the street, and it's in relation to the duty break that security companies are getting on, you know, to armor their vehicles. A lot of persons are saying that this decision, and of course the finance minister started out with this particular one, seems to be, I have to use the word cosmetic again, because it doesn't really address the real issue that these security companies are having. I wanted to find out, what are your thoughts on that?
Those are legitimate concerns raised. I think the intent behind the removal of GCT from the importation of armored courier vehicles is good, and we support the intent. The risks and costs associated with transferring cash across the island have increased significantly because criminals target these armored vehicles. But it's really tinkering around the edges, and it's not a really substantive, direct response to the challenge. We support an increased push by the administration to get society to become far more accepting of a digital currency that perhaps would reduce the need for cash to exist in the machines and across the country, and to be moved around in a volume that it does. So private sector and government, in a kind of public-private sector approach, has to push that kind of narrative so that there can be increased acceptance. And the reality is that there has to be increased security mechanisms to ensure that there is safety surrounding the transfer of cash. So those concerns that this is cosmetic are legitimate concerns. In our estimation, it's really tinkering around the edges.
Keenan, the reverse tax credit, right, being offered to persons earning $3 million or less. A lot of persons are like, we're not sure how we can go and get our $20,000, right? From an economic perspective, and just looking at the macroeconomy, what would you suggest the approach be in terms of operationalizing that?
I think it ought to be the method of least resistance. You know, you don't want to tie up giving $20,000 in such administrative burden that it takes a long time to get it. Because when you look at the budget, the measures had to be balanced between a short-term effect and a long-term effect. The longer-term measures are things like unemployment insurance. You know, that's going to take another year or 2 or 3 to really get the ball rolling. You know, implementing that into payroll systems and so on. If you're promising $20,000, you don't want that a year from now. You want that as soon as possible. And to pay that now would have to be perhaps, you know, a lump sum and the next pay that you get, or whatever distribution mechanisms are available to get money in people's hands as quickly as possible.
Ryan, on the customs duty limit increase, right? We see personal items moving from 50 to 100, and for household, effects moving from 500 to 1,000. We're talking about US dollars here.
Sure.
The finance minister spoke about, the persons who by purchasing goods, within that band being about, I think he said 20%, and the vast majority of persons are above that. So why then not make it just a little bit higher than how he made it?
Good question. I think the finance minister, in his wisdom, probably figured, if I recall, one of the comments he made was that a lot of time is lost in the airport with baggage checks and all of that. So I think it may have been to alleviate that whole wait time and to in a sense, speed the turnaround of persons upon landing to exiting the airport. The cost really was not significant in the grand scheme of things. The number that comes to mind is a few $100 million. However, you can confirm if I'm off with
864 million.
Right. So relatively speaking, it's not as great, but I think the convenience it would offer to the consumer would have been welcomed. I mean, it's not an initiative passed, for the person who cannot buy overseas or leave the country. We would appreciate that, but at the same time, there is something in there for the middle-income person who maybe, or even the person who's going overseas to bring product back for trading purposes. So that's alleviation in a sense, but overall, I don't know if it was intended for a mass take-up past the middle of the road individual.
Yeah, Cleveland, I see you wanting to speak. I'm going to allow you to speak, but we have 2 minutes to the break. I want you to also comment on unemployment insurance. We heard that it's coming, but we're not sure when. Go ahead. Right.
Let's start with the unemployment insurance first. That has bipartisan support. It has long been in the making. It's something that the People's National Party support as well. We have to have some kind of mechanism that gives people some support when they're out of jobs. What we're interested in hearing are the parameters of this unemployment insurance scheme. We think there are several models across the world that we could look at as well. So on our side, we want to hear, and I think the general public wants to hear as well, what are the parameters that will underpin the unemployment insurance scheme, but not much to say on that because it is broadly supported and an important part of the social protection safety net in the country. I want to talk about the reverse tax credit. I think we're missing that an important intent behind the implementation of the reverse tax credit is to encourage compliance with the filing of your tax. I think we need to appreciate that if someone calculates that their tax liability is greater than the tax credit that they will get, that is not a sufficient incentive for them to file their taxes. So I am also concerned that because it's a huge cash transfer scheme, there's likely to be a huge administrative cost that is associated with it. So I think you have to examine that vis-a-vis the benefits that we expect to accrue from it. But I don't see it being a significant incentive for persons who were not filing their taxes before to now file taxes.
Okay, we'll stick a pin there. Stay with us for our closing segment of Budget Debate 2024-2025 Extended, where we will be looking at the implications for the year ahead. See you then. Welcome back to Budget Debate 2024-2025, the extended edition on CVM TV. I'm Andrew Laidley. In this, our final segment, we'll be seeking to find out from our panelists the views on the implications for the budget debate and the lives of Jamaicans. But I want to, before we get to that, just talk a little bit about the pension exemption revenue measure, which was announced, as well as the age relief. I know there's a lot of confusion around it, especially on the ground. So Keenan, how would you really sum that up for the average person?
I mean, it works similar to the income tax threshold of personal incomes. It's just that now persons who would have had their pension payouts, the first 80,000 was taxed, was not taxed, and now that limit has been raised to 250,000. So now more money that is tax-free essentially for pensioners. The age limit was adjusted as well. I believe there is a category for 55 and a category for 65. And as a policy, knowing that it targets those specific persons on fixed incomes, the deleterious impact of inflation, particularly on that demographic, and it not being adjusted for 15 years, it was really a untenable situation, to be honest with you. So I like that policy. It was also relatively inexpensive. It cost, I think, less than $1 billion. And, the magnitude of that, I think, for those persons would be greater than, say, a similar kind of initiative for other demographics, because you're thinking about the most vulnerable. It is really an exercise in social protection. And to basically more than triple that threshold overnight, in your pockets, the kind of translation that works out to be is really, I think, has a desirable effect.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, to you now, something that the opposition spokesman on finance spoke about, and that was that we didn't get a lot of details surrounding the securitization of assets, and therefore it's not 100% clear how the relief measures that he announced would be funded. As a Jamaican, I got from the opposition spokesman that he was saying that it's a slap in the face. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think it's a slap in the face, firstly. I think the minister had said that it was a securitization of receivables, i.e., if entity X or Y, and I'm not going to specify who or what may owe the government payments of some kind, but that's essentially what a receivable would be. Somebody owes you money.
Right.
So they are then essentially outsourcing the collection of those receivables to an external entity to the tune of the $25 billion required to settle these revenue measures.
But don't you believe that the minister could have and should have given a little bit more detail?
I think he very well may, because he will speak again. But I think that higher level concept or laying it out would give an appreciation to the listener, who would then be able to say, well, Minister, what is this? Because he has to close it. So that's a very, in my mind, a pretty easy thing for him to do, because the government is our money, whether it be taxes, GCT, etc., etc. So it's just a matter of, do they want to be in a collection business or in the administering of a lump sum business? And just not to detain Cleveland for too long. The other thing is a matter of surpluses. If we're in a budget surplus at any point, would that then reduce the need for the securitization? So it does seem to be something that can be clawed should the need be required.
Cleveland.
It's a legitimate question to ask the minister. The budget is predicated on securitization of receivables to the tune of $25 billion. And there's no transparency surrounding that. It could mean more than one thing. It could mean that we have debt that is owed to us and we sell it upfront for cash, likely at a discounted rate. We need information surrounding this. Julian, our opposition spokesman, asked the minister after Parliament when he presented, and seemingly unwilling to share, he would have exposed that it's market sensitive. So that prevents him from really disclosing much. And Julian shared this in his budget presentation. But I don't think that that is sufficient enough. The money owed to the government is the people's money. Therefore, there has to be some transparency surrounding it. And we want to hear more. We want to know to who owed us this debt, to who would have sold this debt. So we need transparency surrounding that.
Certainly, and I believe I heard Mr. Robinson also speaking of not knowing whether this would be an ongoing situation. I want to jump over now to you, Keenan, because there's a lot of noise, I believe. Maybe not noise, but people are being vocal about the concerns for the agricultural sector and the removal of GCT on imported raw materials. I understand that the minister is trying to avoid the idea of protectionism, and he in fact spoke about the World Trade Organization and our obligations to that entity. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so before I jump into the agriculture, I just wanted to clarify that the securitization of receivables is a one-off transaction. Okay. So it would not require a continuous stream of discounting receivables in the future. So now on the point of the agriculture, well, obviously, we can't have a differential trade regime where GCT is concerned. And so that was the rationale behind it. But duties still apply to imported produce. And, the duties would have been in excess of the rate of GCT. And so the imports may not necessarily be cheaper. The whole idea was that while the GCT was in place, I would say no, the agriculture sector needed to have been more competitive. Investments ought to have been made in, increasing the productivity. And, whether that has been done or not, we are here now today where GCT is being removed on imports. The second thing I want to say is that you have to think about the relative elasticity of demand for certain goods and produce before you can say that, okay, this is going to necessarily be demanded in greater quantities vis-a-vis local substitutes, so to speak. And so the relationship is not precisely one-to-one, just to say, you're removing GCT, therefore there's going to be a flood of imports of raw vegetables and fruits. And so local farmers are going to be put out of business and so on. It depends on the level of demand. It does depend on the type of produce. It does depend on production quantities and qualities. And I think the wider conversation that needs to be had is that there needs to be continuous investment in agriculture. When agriculture grows, the economy grows. It's about 8% of GDP. It is the largest single sectoral employer of well over 200,000 persons of a labor force of 1.3 million. So agriculture does not deserve scant regard. And local farmers especially don't deserve scant regard. From this policy direction, like I said, you do need a little more figures and to really determine what the precise impact might be on local farmers.
Right, and that's what I was going to do. That's what I was going to. It's still early days yet, so we don't know what the fallout could be, but what would you say or, think could be buffers or incentives that the government could use to sort of assist farmers with this new measure coming in on stream?
I mean, anything that helps to increase production, when you think about incentives for technology, fertilizer, the very granular things at the end of the scale, in trying to really raise productivity. You talk about things like irrigation, other support, strengthening RIADA, I think now becomes even more important, the extension services that they provide, because you want to really give farmers the best chance to increase both their quantity and quality of goods, and whether that be a very short-term measure, it could come under something capital expenditure related on the agriculture budget side for the next fiscal year and beyond. That's where I think the attention needs to be turned to.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, for many years, businesses and corporate entities have been calling for some kind of reprieve in taxes, and we saw some of that coming out in the finance minister's presentation with IPP surrounding renewable energy providers, and I believe there was also a tax relief for corporate entities as well. Do you believe that business owners are appeased? Do you think that would have appeased them?
Consistent with the theme before, I think it would have been welcomed, but there's always going to be the desire for more, and that's a human nature. I think something else that is beneficial is the raising the junior market threshold, to the extent that it would encourage, whilst that would encourage or have entities list and not pay corporate tax for five years, and then half of that rate, effective rate of 12.5% for the next 5 years. That has proven to be an ignition for growth, an igniter for growth in the economy in terms of the individual entities, the extent to which they're able to employ more persons, retool. So that has helped in some ways to fast track the automation of the economy, and it is something that I think would have also been welcomed by the entrepreneurial class. And so overall,
We're coming up on the end of the show, but Cleveland, I'm going to give you the final word. I heard the opposition spokesman on finance talking about a new economic model. What would that look like?
Right. Before we get into what the new economic model...
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time, though.
would look like...
30 seconds.
There's a concern that we have about the increase in the cap for the junior stock exchange. We know that it is applied to new new listings on the junior stock exchange. We want to know why it's not similarly applied to existing listings on the junior stock exchange. But right, about moving the economy forward. The economy is stuck in a state of low growth, low wage, and low productivity. There has to be a re-engineering of the focus in terms of looking at the kind of structural challenges. One, we need to prioritize our medium, small, and micro enterprises. The degree of technical assistance that they need is not being provided to the extent that they need it.
10 seconds.
When we look at the support provided by Development Bank of Jamaica, a lot of the capital injection that they could benefit from are not taken up. So that capital portfolio provided by the DBJ is not sufficiently taken up by MSMEs. We need a direct focus on them so we can get them to increase the value of their exports, increase the value of their production.
Cleveland, I'm going to have to stop you there. I know we have a lot more to share on that, and we will be continuing this conversation in subsequent series of the Budget Debate Extended. All right, so that's where we conclude the first edition of CVM's Budget Debate 2024-2025 Extended coverage. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Keenan Falconer, for joining me, Ryan Strawn for joining me, Cleveland Tomlinson. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, I've been your host, Andrew Laidley. Pleasant viewing.